On October 19th, 1781, General Lord Cornwallis and his British Army surrendered to an American force under the command of George Washington and Rochambeau at Yorktown. After a long and arduous campaign that had taken the British Army through the Carolinas and to Virginia, they had finally been caught and besieged by this Franco-American force. The surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown marked a major turning point in the American Revolution. Indeed, when George III heard the news that Lord Cornwallis had surrendered, he exclaimed, "Good God, it is all over." Well, as usual, the king was wrong. It wasn't over. The American Revolution did not end at Yorktown. The war would continue for 2 more years, in a time when the end of the war was still and would remain in doubt. No one understood better that Yorktown was not the end of the war than the commander-in-chief himself. Shortly after the surrender of Lord Cornwallis, Washington wrote to his friend, Governor Nelson of Virginia. He wrote to the governor that what he feared was that instead of exciting our exertions, the victory at Yorktown will produce such a relaxation in the prosecution of the war as will prolong the calamities of it. A few days later, he wrote to the American commander in the South, General Nathanael Greene, expressing the same sentiments. Washington feared that the good news from Yorktown would push the Americans to relax their effort against the king, and that in that relaxation, the revolution might yet be lost. After taking Cornwallis's surrender, Washington returned to Mount Vernon for a brief respite. It was, in fact, only the second time that he had been home during the entire years of the Revolution. After spending a few days at Mount Vernon, he and Martha journeyed to Philadelphia. His plan was to spend the winter of 1781-1782 with the Congress. He knew that he needed to persuade them that the war was not over, and to persuade them and to encourage them to continue their support for the effort. He arrived in Philadelphia to the acclaim of all of the citizens. He was indeed the conquering hero. Parades, banquets, they even wrote an opera in his honor. Washington was enthralled with the attention. To be sure, he enjoyed it a bit, but he was also troubled. He did not attend sessions of Congress. That would have been inappropriate. He was, after all, the commander-in-chief, not a member of that body. But every Monday night, he and certain other key figures would meet at the home of Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance. There, in Mr. Morris's quarters, Washington, the Secretary at War, Benjamin Lincoln, occasionally James Madison, a young member of the Congress, would meet to discuss the major issues confronting the Congress and the new nation. The principal one was money. The Congress had run out of money and had little or no way to get more. They had no power of taxation. The only power they had was to ask the Congress, rather to ask the states to send them money. By this time, late in the war, the states were exhausted themselves. They had little to send and sent very little. After several weeks spending winter in Philadelphia, Washington finally decided that it was time for him to return to his army. The American army had left Virginia after Cornwallis's surrender and had marched to the Hudson River just north of New York City and taken up a position there. They chose that site because the British still occupied New York City, and from the heights along the Hudson, they could observe the British and prevent them from leaving the city. Before he left, Washington returned to the Congress to ask their permission to depart. They granted permission to the commander-in-chief and then told him, quote, "We have nothing particular to give you and have appointed this audience only to assure you of our esteem and confidence and to wish you happiness and success." And with that happiness and success, Washington left to rejoin the army. He went to the Hudson encampment, and there he found an army in distress. He found an army that had not been paid, an army that wondered why they were still in the field, for they too thought the war was over. At the same time, the British in New York City were strong. The British had recently welcomed a new commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces in North America, General Sir Guy Carleton. Carleton had under his command, as a garrison in that city, more troops than all of the American army combined. But Carleton had arrived with orders from the ministry that he was not to undertake any offensive operations. For by this time, in Parliament, in London, war weariness had set in. The king, stubborn as always, would not give in to any thought of American independence, but at the same time there was a growing furor within Parliament that demanded an end to this reckless war, as some refer to it. And so for the moment then, it was a waiting position. General Carleton within the confines of New York City, watching, waiting. General Washington with his army outside New York City, watching and waiting. In the midst of this, General Washington received an astounding letter. It was a letter from Colonel Nicola. Colonel Nicola was the commander of the Regiment of Invalids. The colonel was an experienced military man. He had served in the British Army and had come to America shortly before the Revolution broke out. During the early days of the Revolution, he had actually written a military manual for the Continental Army. The regiment that he commanded was made up of men no longer fit for service. These were men who, through sickness, disease, or perhaps wounded in combat, were no longer able to serve in the line. Nonetheless, they could still provide valuable service in garrison duty as support troops. Each day, when Colonel Nicola mustered his regiment and walked down that line, he saw the true costs of war. And so he wrote to General Washington to express his discontent. He wrote to the general, "When this war is over, we who have borne the heat and labor of the day will be forgotten and neglected. The army will not submit to this grave injustice. From several conversations I have had with officers, I believe it is generally intended not to separate after the peace, till all grievances are addressed, engagements and promises fulfilled. This war must have shown to all, but to military men in particular, the weakness of republics." Nicola went on to say that the weakness of republics meant that the only salvation would be a monarchy. Now, Nicola did not mention Washington by name, but the implication was clear. Would not Washington make a fine king? Ordinarily, when the commander-in-chief received correspondence from his officers, it would take him several days to respond, to conjure up a response for his secretaries to prepare it. On this occasion, Washington replied to Nicola almost instantaneously. He wrote back to the colonel, "I have read your letter with a mixture of surprise and astonishment. No occurrence in the course of the war has given me more painful sensations than your information of there being such ideas existing in the army." He went on to tell the colonel that he would address the problems of the army, but only in a constitutional way. A short time later, Washington received another disturbing letter, this time from Major General James Mitchell Varnum. General Varnum was from Rhode Island. He was an officer in the Continental Army and had also served in the Continental Congress. He was a man of considerable influence. General Varnum wrote to the commander-in-chief, "The Congress is a baseless fabric. My fellow citizens are totally destitute of that love of equality which is absolutely requisite to support a republic. Only an absolute monarchy, a military state, can alone save us from the horrors of subjugation. Washington now knew how deep the discontent was in his army. He apparently did not respond to General Varnum, but a few days later he did write to Secretary at War Benjamin Lincoln, his civilian superior. He wrote to the secretary, "If these men, who have given the flower of their days in establishing the freedom and independence of their country, are sent home without one farthing of money, great discontent will arise. The patience and long sufferance of this army are almost exhausted." What Washington feared at this moment was winter quarters. The army was about to move to its winter quarters at Newberg, New York, a town about 12 miles north of West Point. This certainly was not the first time that Washington has taken his army into winter quarters. But in previous examples at Morristown, at Valley Forge, there had always been the promise of a spring campaign to bring the men forward. There would be, all acknowledged, no spring campaign this time. How then would Washington keep the morale of his troops up? How would he keep discipline in the ranks if this long winter invaded upon them? And so the army moved to Newberg to begin its winter quarters. At the same time, more bad news arrived. General Horatio Gates. General Horatio Gates and General Washington had a long, unhappy acquaintance. General Gates, back in 1777, had been the commander at the Battle of Saratoga, a great American victory where General Burgoyne, the British commander, had surrendered to General Gates. In 1777, General Gates was the hero of America. This is the same year that General Washington abandoned Philadelphia. It was at that moment when many in the Congress began to murmur, might not Gates make a better commander-in-chief than Washington? Nothing would come of this, but there was an alleged conspiracy to replace Gates, to send Gates to replace Washington. Washington knew of this and harbored great anger towards General Gates. Gates later went south to command the American army in the Carolinas. While in the South, he suffered a tremendous defeat at the Battle of Camden, from which he emerged in disgrace. From that moment until this moment, General Gates had been lobbying for another command, and the Congress had been reluctant. But finally, he sort of wore them down. And so the Congress sent General Gates to serve with General Washington, leaving it to General Washington to decide how to use the general. They had not consulted with Washington about this action. And so General Gates shows up. Washington put him in command of the army at Newberg. That is, that Gates would command the army in the encampment, while Washington took up his headquarters a little bit distant from the encampment at a place called Hasbrouck House. So Washington now had to deal with an army in discontent and a general not necessarily loyal to him. The army immediately went to hutting. They began to build huts to endure the winter. About 700 small wooden huts were built. By the time they finished this work in December of 1782, Newberg encampment was one of the largest communities in North America. Then other things had to be found to keep the men busy. They built roads, cleared forests, picked up around the barracks, did patrol duty. But it was all a bit of a sham, for there was nothing really important to do. As the pay continued to grow in arrears, the Congress had no little money to pay the army. The discontent in the encampment grew, and Washington knew this. He gave them another task to keep them busy. Let us build a temple of virtue, he said. And so the army built this large assembly hall on the top of a hill overlooking the encampment. It was a place where they could hold Sunday services, and during the week it was a sort of administrative headquarters. And they called it the Temple of Virtue. In the meantime, in Philadelphia, the Congress was enduring its own sufferings, financial for the most part. For nearly all of the war, there had been a sort of two camps in the Congress. One, let us refer to them as nationalists, and the others sort of the old revolutionaries. They represented really two philosophies. The nationalists were those who saw in the promise of America a great nation, a united nation, a strong central government that would lead, as some referred to it, a rising American empire. And then there were others, the old revolutionaries. These were men who were loyal to their states, who saw in the revolution the ultimate expression of home rule. They were distrustful of central government. After all, was not the revolution a war against a central government? So there had been for some time this underlying discontent, friction between these two factions. This friction became more apparent as the crisis in the Congress arose. There was fear in the Congress that indeed this effort might simply collapse if the Congress was not more powerful. There were certain young men in the Congress, men who had served in the Army, who saw the promise of America, who began to talk about creating a stronger central body. Among them, Robert Morris, the Superintendent of Finance, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, and certain others. And they began to meet those Monday evening meetings at the superintendent's home. And they began to conjure up plans, perhaps, to strengthen the Congress. How might we get the states to send money and to give us greater power? As the Congress debated this, some in private, some in the body in public, there arrived in Philadelphia a memorial from the officers at Newberg. The officers at Newberg had gathered and collectively had written a document, an appeal to the Congress. They asked Washington's permission to deliver this memorial in person. Washington was reluctant. He had always been very careful to keep the military and civilian separate, carefully separate. But he knew that if he did not give permission to these men to deliver this memorial to Philadelphia, it might cause even further disturbance. And so he gave permission. 3 officers were assigned the task to carry this memorial to Philadelphia. Colonel John Brooks from Massachusetts, Colonel Matthias Ogden from New Jersey, and General Alexander McDougall from New York. These 3 men were given the mission to bring to the Congress an appeal from the officers. They arrived and delivered the appeal. It began by asking the Congress, as the head and sovereign, to hear our plea. We have borne all that men can bear in further experiments on our patients may have fatal consequences. The Congress took the appeal and gave it to a committee to reflect upon. And the committee deliberated, but could find no solution. In the meantime, the nationalists in the Congress began to see an opportunity here. Might they not use the discontent rising in the Army as a lever to pry further power from the states towards the Congress? But they had an enemy. The enemy was peace. Peace. By this time, in late 1782 and early 1783, rumors were beginning to circulate. No hard news, but rumors were circulating that perhaps negotiations were underway in London and Paris. The Congress had not heard from their commissioners in Paris for some time. For many months they had not heard. But nonetheless, they had some hope. If peace should arrive, then the lever that the Congress hoped for would be broken. As long as war existed, there was an external force pushing the states together, keeping them together. Gouverneur Morris, not Robert, who was Robert's assistant, Gouverneur Morris wrote to a friend about this matter, and he said, "Not much for the interest of America that peace should be made at present. The fear of peace." Feeling the press of time, the nationalists began to make their move. They talked to these officers, to Ogden, to Brooks, and to McDougall, to get a better sense of what was going on at Newberg. They decided that it would be well to open communication with Washington and with Washington's closest friend, Henry Knox. Knox was the commander of the garrison at West Point, not far from Newberg. And so it was given to Gouverneur Morris to open a correspondence with General Knox. He wrote to the general, beginning his letter, "My dear friend, the Army may now influence the legislatures, and if you will permit me a metaphor from your own profession, after you have carried the post, the public creditors will garrison it for you." This was a subtle test. Might Knox help us with his influence over the Army to push the states? The task of writing to General Washington was given to Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton and Washington had an unusual relationship. Alexander Hamilton was a bastard, born so, in the West Indies. Came to New York on the eve of the Revolution, joined in the Patriot cause, emerged as a very fine officer, rose to the rank of colonel, came to the attention of the commander-in-chief, who invited him to join him on his staff, which Colonel Hamilton did. But there was an occasion. It was at headquarters. The colonel was coming down the stairs. The commander-in-chief was going up the stairs. The commander-in-chief said to the colonel, "Colonel, I wish you to join me immediately." The colonel responded, "In a moment, sir." That was the wrong response. Washington turned on Hamilton and berated him right there. Hamilton took great umbrage at this and resigned from the staff. He later returned to active duty and distinguished himself at the Battle of Yorktown, and then, after that, was elected to the Congress. And so it was the task given to Hamilton to write to Washington, to the commander-in-chief. He wrote to Washington about the situation. Washington needed no instruction on the discontent in the Army. Hamilton pointed it out to him, and he asked Washington to, quote, "guide the torrent." Would Washington guide the torrent? He then went on to write to Washington and tell him something that deeply offended the commander-in-chief. He told Washington that there were rumors in the Army that he, Washington, had not done enough to support his men. That was deeply hurtful to a man who had never left the side of his army, that somehow he could be accused of not standing in their support. I cannot tell you with any certainty that after these letters were received by Knox and Washington, that those two gentlemen talked with one another. The written record is silent, blank. But here's a point where perhaps we should intrude with common sense. I do believe that Knox and Washington, whose headquarters were only a few miles apart, who were the closest of friends, I cannot but believe that they discussed the letters they had just received from Philadelphia. It took a few days for a response to be prepared. But Knox was the first to respond, and he responded to Gouverneur Morris. "Sir, I consider the reputation of the American Army as one of the most immaculate things on earth. We should even suffer wrongs and injuries to the utmost degree of toleration rather than sully it in the least degree. I hope to God that the army will never be directed than against the enemies of the liberties of America. Well, Morris knew where Knox stood. A few days later, Washington responded to Colonel Hamilton. Sir, the fatal tendency to involve the army in political matters would be productive of civil commotion and end in blood. I stand as citizen and soldier. Note the order of the words. I stand as citizen and soldier. Well, the Nationalists had been rebuffed. They could not depend upon Knox. They could not depend upon Washington. Who might they turn to now? General Gates. General Gates kept his headquarters at a place called Ellison House, not far from the Newberg encampment. Here is an example where it's often important for an historian to go and see a place that you're writing about. There had been many stories told since these events that General Gates was unaware of what was going on, that he didn't know of any conspiracy. Well, I visited Ellison House. It's a lovely house, built, as they say, in the Dutch style. Stone house. 4 rooms up, 4 rooms down. It was in this house that General Gates kept his headquarters, the Gates, occasionally, his guard, his aides, his servants, and there was even a small hospital in the building. And, by the way, the Ellisons were still in residence. It was a crowded place. It would have been impossible for anything to have gone on of any importance in that house that everyone in that house would not have been aware of. And so then, it is General Gates to whom the Nationalists turn. General Gates has surrounded himself with some young adjutants. Young men, not inexperienced, but not completely experienced either. They worship General Gates. They call him, by the way, Granny Gates. They think of him affectionately. They will do anything for him, and they will do anything for the Republic. Officers named Armstrong, in particular, Major Armstrong, is key and central to this figure. Word arrives from Philadelphia that the Nationalists have failed in their attempts at Knox and Washington. When that word arrives at Ellison House, General Gates's staff goes to work, in particular, Major Armstrong. An officer from Philadelphia, Colonel Stewart, arrives on the 8th of March, Saturday, the 8th of March, bringing news of what's happening or what's not happening in Philadelphia. The next day, the 9th, the officers at Ellison House are busy, in particular, Major Armstrong. They are preparing an address. We know this for certain because the original copy of the address is in Armstrong's hand. The next day, Monday, March the 10th, this address appears at the Temple of Virtue, the headquarters of the encampment. It is anonymous, but it begins, "Gentlemen, a fellow soldier whose interest and affections bind him strongly to you, whose past sufferings has been as great and whose future fortunes may be as desperate as yours, would beg leave to address you. Will Congress address our wrongs, or will they trample on our rights? If peace comes and we put down our swords, what then?" The address called for a meeting the next day, Tuesday, March the 11th, at the Temple of Virtue of all of the officers in the encampment to discuss these important issues. Washington, of course, quickly saw this address and issued a general order canceling the meeting on Tuesday. It had been called without his permission. This could not happen. But in canceling the meeting on Tuesday, he knew that he had to have an alternative. And so he said, he, the commander-in-chief, would call a meeting for Saturday, March the 15th at noon. The next day, Wednesday, the following day on Thursday and Fridays, much went on in the encampment as everyone prepared for this meeting that was to take place Saturday, noon, March 15th, in the Temple of Virtue. What might it be? What might happen? Washington announced that he would not be at the meeting. The senior general in command would preside, that being, of course, General Gates. On the morning of March the 15th, Saturday, the officers in the encampment began to trudge up the hill towards the Temple of Virtue. Altogether, there were about 300 of them. They crowded into the room. They took their places on benches and sat. After they had assembled, General Gates appeared. They all came to attention. General Gates moved to the front of the room, invited them to be seated. As they were seated, there was noise outside, the noise of horses' hoofs and the rattle of sabers. It was General Washington's life guard and the general. And there suddenly appeared in the doorway this very imposing figure, well-dressed as always, tall, erect, and it was the commander-in-chief. The men immediately snapped to attention again. General Gates acknowledged the presence of the commander-in-chief. Washington came forward and took his place, asked the men to be seated again, for he wished to address them. Major Samuel Shaw, who was present at this meeting, described that moment. Every eye was fixed upon the illustrious man, and attention to their beloved general held the audience mute. They sat there waiting for the general to speak. He took from his pocket a sheaf of documents and laid them in front of him. And he said to the officers, "Gentlemen, you must forgive me, but the moment is so important that I have prepared a speech," which he then began to read. It is not long. The entire speech probably delivered in certainly less than 10 minutes. But he begins, "Gentlemen, by an anonymous summons, an attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, and how subversive of all order and discipline. Let the good sense of the army decide." He then went on to remind them in the most emotional way that this man could summon, that he had never left their side for 1 minute, except that on public business, that he had always been with them, and how deeply hurt he was that anyone could think otherwise. He reminded them of the cause for which they had fought, and the danger in which that cause now was because of their actions. He then completed his speech. "While I give you these assurances and pledge myself in the most unequivocal manner to exert whatever ability I am possessed of in your favor, may I entreat you, gentlemen, on your part, not to take any measures which, viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country and place a full confidence in the purity of the intentions of Congress, that previous to your dissolution as an army, they will cause all of your accounts to be fairly liquidated, as directed in their resolutions, which were published to you 2 days ago, and that they will adopt the most effectual measures in their power to render ample justice to you for your faithful and meritorious service. And let me conjure you, in the name of our common country, as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any specious pretenses, to overturn the liberties of our country, and who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discords and deluge our rising empire in blood. By thus determining and thus acting, you will pursue the plain and direct road to the attainment of your wishes. You will defeat the insidious designs of our enemies, who are compelled to resort from open force to secret artifice. You will give one more distinguished proof of unexampled patriotism and patient virtue, rising superior to the pressure of the most complicated sufferings. And you will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world has never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. Washington finished his remarks, and the officers were silent. It was at that moment that he feared he had lost them, that they had not heard him, or that they had heard him and rejected him. He paused. He reached into his pocket again, and this time he pulled out a letter. It was a letter from Joseph Jones, a delegate to the Congress from Virginia. It was a somewhat perfunctory letter. A letter in which Joseph Jones assured the commander-in-chief that Congress would indeed pay the army. Washington began to read the letter. He stumbled over some words. He reached into his pocket again, and he pulled out his glasses. These were new to him, for in the Washington papers there was a letter written only about 2 weeks before this event. A letter to David Rittenhouse, a Philadelphia scientist, optometrist, in which Washington wrote to Rittenhouse that he had received the glasses, but he regretted he was having a little bit of trouble using them. And so now he took them out and put them on. His officers had never seen the commander-in-chief wearing glasses. He apologized to the officers, telling them, "Gentlemen, you must forgive me. My hair has grown gray, and my eyes have grown dim in the service of my country." Probably not a dry eye in the house. He finished reading the Jones letter, returned the letter and the address and his glasses, and left. Almost immediately, Henry Knox, sitting in the audience, rose to his feet, moved a series of resolutions supporting the general, supporting the Congress, and within a matter of 20 minutes it was all done and approved. Do you think the stage had been set? Oh, yes. And I came to that conclusion in a rather unusual way. One of the great documents, the central document of this event, is in fact the Newberg Address, one of the prized possessions at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The original Newberg Address, that is the original written by Washington's secretary, is in the Library of Congress. And it's a fine document, written in the good hand of a secretary. But the copy at the Massachusetts Historical Society is written in the hand of Washington. And there's a significant difference. The copy in Washington's hand is in large letters. Large enough, you see, so that he could read it without his glasses. So what happened at headquarters Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday? No direct evidence, but I am convinced that Washington and his secretaries spent considerable time writing what which was one of the most important speeches ever delivered in American history. And after they had written the speech, Washington looked at it and probably said, "I'll never be able to read that." And so he sat at his desk and he copied the speech out in his own large hand so that he'd be able to read it. The resolutions went to Congress. Any possible mutiny had now been averted. And then, ironically, at almost the very same time that the news from Newberg arrives in Philadelphia, news from Paris arrives as well. And the news from Paris is peace. Peace. A treaty has been agreed to. Not yet ratified, that will take a bit more time, but a peace treaty has been agreed to. When the news arrives at Newberg of peace, Washington issues an order, a cessation of arms, and he posts this order on the door of the Temple of Virtue, where the army gathers to see it and hear it read, that the war is over. The date of this occasion? April 19th, 1783. 8 years to the day. The battles at Lexington and Concord. Washington still has some unfinished business. The army will gradually go home and be discharged in an orderly fashion. It will take a long time before they get their pay, that's true, but they will eventually. Washington returns to the Congress. By this time, the Congress has left Philadelphia and they're meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. Washington heads south, stopping first at New York City. That's the place that he had been chased out of in 1776. And now the British are leaving. On November the 25th, 1783, Washington rides into New York City at the head of his army. It must have been a wonderful moment for the Commander-in-Chief to return to the place that he had left in 76. After bidding farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern, Washington left New York to continue his journey to the Congress at Annapolis. He arrived there on a special mission. He arrived to return to the Congress his commission, which they had given to him in 1775, for he was returning, like Cincinnatus, to his civilian life. In a touching but brief moment, he presented the document to the President of the Congress. He then retired and returned to Mount Vernon, arriving home Christmas Eve, 1783. A few days after his return, he corresponded with his friends, announcing to them how happy he was to be at his beloved Mount Vernon, a place from which he never intended to leave. His years of public service, he said, were at an end.